So this is my talk today. I've kind of beefed it up a little bit. I think we are at the beginning of an unfolding health disaster. And I'm going to try and demonstrate that. I'm going to talk initially about carbon dioxide in our environment, the background, how it works in the body, and also then I'm going to talk about the health effects. So in terms of context and background, this graph of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, these are actual measurements of CO2 in the atmosphere. I like this representation because it combines the most recent direct measurements in red. In fact, this is from the CSIRO site in Tasmania, Cape Grim, and it combines with the last 2,000 years of ice core measurements. So they are basically direct measurements of air trapped in the ice. You can see they line up, and you can see it's kind of out of control. I think this is a graph that should be shown to everybody. Everyone should be aware of this, but I don't think they really are. But my point is that we know, and I'll talk about this, but we know that high levels of carbon dioxide. Sorry, I'm going back again. How do I go back? High levels of carbon dioxide are toxic, and I'll demonstrate that. And there's got to be some point at which, as this atmospheric level goes up, there's got to be some point that we start thinking, is this going to be a problem for us? And I don't think anybody is really asking that question at the moment. I think there's evidence that it's already a problem. You're probably thinking, surely not. We would have heard about this if that was true. But our perception of CO2 is often kind of anecdotal. We assume that it's not toxic, which is not true, because there's actually a safe level set of 5,000 parts per million for a working day, for an 8-hour exposure. And there is evidence that it's very dangerous at higher levels. I was going to try and demonstrate some things with people in this room, but there's not many people in this room. But we have to cope with high levels of CO2 in indoor environments quite often. Often over 1,000 parts per million, up to 10,000 parts per million. And we can cope with that generally, and we know we can cope with it. So why is that a problem, But actually, there are studies that show there are health effects from indoor levels of CO2. And, there are potentially, this has got a timing on it. Damn it. Go back again. Yeah, so, and there are studies that suggest that there are consequences of ongoing exposure to high levels of CO2. And there's an assumption that CO2 levels in the past have been high or higher than now, or as high as now, while humans have been around. And that's just not true. And I'll show you the next slide. This is from the Hawaii site now. The Americans collect this data. This is direct measurements of CO2. And you can see, well, it looks a bit like it's accelerating. And of course, Donald Trump's stopped the funding of this site now, and we may lose these measurements altogether. And that's the graph I was showing before. And if you take the ice cores back even further, you go back to around about 1 million years. It may be a little bit more, but in general, the ice cores are showing that the CO2 levels have been below 300 parts per million the entire time. And beyond that, though, you get things like proxy data, which are not direct measurements, but indirect indications of what the CO2 was doing, because there's errors associated with it. I'm showing an example here where this study showed 2 different types of methods that were almost identical. That's based on isotopes, boron isotopes in zooplankton and carbon isotopes in phytoplankton. And it's showing that the CO2 levels were less than 300 parts per million, or quite possibly less than 300 for 25 million years. And that's the entire, well, almost the entire period of our evolution as primates. That goes back to the early primates. So we've never had to deal with that. I put this in as context as well because we might think we can escape the problem, but it just CO2 distributes itself across the globe quite evenly. And this picture is actually from NASA satellite, probably under threat as well. It measures carbon dioxide, and it's been heavily averaged to give us a reasonable picture. And you can see that in the northern hemisphere, the CO2 levels are about 10 parts per million greater than in the southern hemisphere. And that's because the northern hemisphere is where all the CO2 is being produced from the industrial processes, power plants, whatever. There's a little bit circulating into the southern hemisphere. But my point here is that, over the whole planet there, the difference is about 14 ppm going from 406 to 420. And that level is much greater than, what it was in 1820 when it was 280 parts per million. So there's no escape. And initially when I started looking at this, I found sort of the occupational and safety and health guidelines of what CO2 toxicity was, because no one thought it was toxic at all. But in fact, at high levels, at 9%, 5%, steadily in a short period. So they set the short-term exposure limit for 10 minutes at 3%. And no, they noted also that between 1 and 2% CO2, there were symptoms or stress on the autonomic nervous system and all those sort of symptoms. And so based on that, they set an exposure limit, this was a long time ago, for an 8-hour working day, and that's 5,000 parts per million, which in my mind was, well, that's only in one order of magnitude. Oh God, one order of magnitude greater than the atmosphere outside right now. Logically one would think that if you're thinking of a lifetime exposure, because that's what it's going to be in the future with climate change, it's a lifetime exposure to greater levels of CO2, it would be much lower than 5,000 parts per million. And we're already looking at indoor levels which are in that range. And this is a sort of background to indoor levels. The graph at the top there is the life of a student in Singapore who carried a CO2 monitor with him for 6 days. And the spikes, which are up around 6,000 parts per million, are when he's on public transport. And these slow, gradual increases are when he's sleeping in a one-bedroom apartment with an air conditioner on and the windows closed. So it gradually increases. And that's because, which I forgot to mention, humans breathe out around 4% carbon dioxide, which is quite a lot. So when you've got lots of people in public spaces, in classrooms, offices, buses, the levels can often be between 1 and 5,000 parts per million. And this graph down the bottom on the right is in a car when I think there was 4 people, and they had the recirculation set to on, so you're not getting fresh air from outside, and it got up to 10,000. Oh, we did try to turn this off, didn't we? But it's not. I don't know why it's still on. Yeah, so 10,000 parts per million after half an hour. And that's quite significant if there's health effects and we're driving long distances, we want to, we've got to worry about that, but no one seems to know about it. Now, talking about how it works in the body, basically carbon dioxide is produced through the process of creating energy. And, we breathe oxygen, combines with our food, creates energy, and carbon dioxide and water are the byproducts. And oxygen, it's it transports from the lungs to the cells by attaching to hemoglobin, which acts a bit like a truck. Sorry about this. Acts a bit like a truck. And but the carbon dioxide doesn't work like that. It's got a bit of a problem. It has to, it doesn't really, only some of it attaches to hemoglobin. It doesn't really dissolve terribly well in water. It does a little bit, but not fast enough for it to be processed by the body to be removed as a waste product. So it does this little trick. It combines, it's processed by this quite incredible enzyme, which is called carbonic anhydrase, the Ca enzyme. And the process is that it converts carbon dioxide and water into acid and bicarbonate. And the bicarbonate then readily dissolves in the blood. And that's how it carries the carbon dioxide, which is inside that molecule. So there's a strong relationship between the amount of carbon dioxide and the amount of acid in your blood. And that's a very important aspect here. So yeah, so the CO2 is transported as bicarbonate, and then when it gets back to the lungs, it's converted back to CO2 by the same enzyme, which is quite amazing, really. Yeah, and the really important point here is the acid levels are controlled. The acid levels are the things that control your rate of breathing, and that's really important. And the acid levels are sort of influenced by the CO2, but under sort of any atmospheric conditions or the amount of CO2 in the air, there's a kind of an equilibrium between the amount of CO2 in the air, your breathing rate, pH of your blood, CO2 levels in the body, sort of being maintained in equilibrium. But what happens, when CO2 levels in the atmosphere are going up, it sort of puts things out of equilibrium. There was a paper that really got my interest early on in this topic that demonstrated they used theoretical calculations of what the equilibrium pH of the blood would do when you increase the atmospheric concentrations of CO2. And this author actually came up with the result that at 426 parts per million, the atmosphere would become toxic, that it would push acidity of the blood to unhealthy levels, because this acidity in the blood is extremely important for the body. The body needs to maintain a kind of neutral pH, otherwise it's in trouble. But there was one thing they didn't really consider with this work, and that was that we have a compensation methods in our body, and a physiological compensation for acidity takes various forms, and probably the most one that we're aware of is that when we exercise, we breathe out CO2, and we need to, like, we're producing a lot of energy, so we're producing a lot of CO2, and it's being controlled by the pH, and so the blood starts to get acid, and the chemoreceptors send messages to our muscles, which control our breathing, and we breathe faster. And I'll keep my hand on this. The other methods, like the buffering systems in the blood, so the bicarbonate is actually used as a buffering system for the acid. Acid is the amount of hydrogen ions. The kidneys get involved as well after a certain amount of time, and they can excrete, get rid of acid and retain bicarbonate for buffering. And also the bones are involved in terms of exchanging cations with acid and bicarbonate. But the type of compensation depends on what level of CO2 you're dealing with in the air, and how long you're exposed to it for. And what we don't know is what level of atmospheric CO2 is when compensation kicks in, and what's the effect of ongoing compensation. So we don't really know. And the last point, which is really important for this talk, is can the body compensate for increasing CO2 retention? And the idea there is that, you know, if the breathing rate's controlled by pH, and that's being compensated for by these techniques, then if the level goes up in the air, then we're going to start retaining CO2. It's going to start building up in our bodies. And I believe that I've found some evidence for exactly that. That's really why I'm here today. On the left-hand side, the graph on the left is from a paper from 2014. And what they did was analyze data from a thing called the US National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, NANES, which has lots of health data from over 20 years, from 1999 to 2020. In this case, what they looked at was the blood chemistry results of bicarbonate. This is something that you would get if you went to the doctor and got your blood tested. You would see bicarbonate in those results. And they've averaged for about 7,000 people over about every 2 years over that period. And they finished their survey in 2012. And what they noticed was that the bicarbonate levels were increasing in the human body. Or it appeared so. You know, there's not a lot of data there, but it looks like it. And they put the blue graph here is actually the atmospheric levels going up, direct measurements. So their conclusion was that it's possible that, you know, because of the increasing air CO2, that the levels of bicarbonate are going up in our blood. And that's because, you know, more CO2, more bicarbonate, because it's carrying the CO2. So what I did was I came along, I looked at the remaining data, because it's now 2025. And I got 4 more data points, and you can see all the original data points in the graph there. And it sort of strengthens the correlation. So it appears that bicarbonate is going up in human blood. That represents a physiological change, and it's scary. And people should be aware of this. And of course, if you extend that line to, you know, because on your blood test results, you're going to have upper health limits, safety limits, you know, for that substance. And for bicarbonate, the upper health limit is 29 millimoles per liter. And according to the equation of that trend line, that's going to be reached by the year 2063 at a atmospheric level of 506 parts per million. And there's other studies that suggest, actually this study on the last point here was a study of the NANES data, and they found that greater than 26 millimoles per liter is associated with increased deaths from cardiovascular disease. So perhaps we don't have to get to the upper limit before it becomes a problem. And 26 is going to be reached next year, you know, so actually I'll just go back again to, you know, with what I'm saying here is that the reason why it's going up is because the pH is being compensated for. So it's not, our breathing is not changing. But there was no measurement of pH in the blood in the NANES data set, so I couldn't really confirm that. But there have been other studies. This one is a study of 20 humans in a submarine for 58 days at a level of 7,000 parts per million. And what they found, that's quite a long time at quite a high level. That's what happens in submarines because they can't really get rid of the carbon dioxide. But what they found generally was that at the end of 58 days, the bicarbonate was going up and continuing to go up. But the pH, it dropped because the more carbon dioxide was affecting the acidity. But the compensation sort of kicked in after about 20 days, it's probably the kidneys, and the levels came back up again. So after 2 months, the pH was normalized. So even just looking at that, that means that the breathing is going to be the same. CO2 is building up in the body. So that's my interpretation. Breathing is the way that we get rid of CO2. pH is controlling the rate of breathing. Yeah, our breathing rate remains the same. I'm just repeating myself here, but yeah. So I wanted to look in the database, in the NANOS data. I wanted to look for more. Was there something else in the blood chemistry that might provide a clue? And I had, in my review, I had come across some old research from the US Navy research labs that looked at calcium and phosphorus levels. This one at the top here is showing that the urinary calcium and phosphorus in a they were exposed to a lot, 1.5% carbon dioxide, 15,000 or 42 days. And before the survey, they'd taken readings, and it showed, that the serum calcium and phosphorus reduced, basically went down after being exposed to CO2. And their interpretation was that the CO2 was being stored in the body and deposited along with calcium and phosphorus in the bones as a way of storing CO2. And there was not very much data on this, but there was another study by the same author who did animal experiments on guinea pigs, and there were cyclic levels of Ca and P. So I thought, well, okay, that's interesting. I know that calcium and phosphorus in the blood was present in the NANOS dataset over 20 years. So I had a look at it, and I was absolutely shocked when I saw the results. This is a little bit scary, I think, because this is just the raw data. This is the raw data averages of 7,000 people over 20 years, not the same 7,000 people, but it's an average of a population over 20 years. It represents the only real long-term study of something like this. And because calcium and phosphorus are very important elements in our health, and once again, if you extend those lines, those trend lines, into the future to get to the lower health limits for both elements, they were both came out the same year, 2085, at a level of 553 parts per million. A lot of assumptions there that this is a linear relationship. It could be, the health limits could be reached a lot earlier than that. We just don't know. So interpreting that is that I think exactly what Schaefer and the US Navy labs suggested is happening. I think it's happening. That CO2 right now is being stored in the bones of humans as bicarbonate combined with calcium phosphate carbonates, which remove the calcium and phosphorus from the blood. And in the future, and maybe even now, it may not just be the bones where it's happening, because there's evidence to suggest that calcification of kidneys and arteries is also part of the process. And it seems to be indicating that we're just simply not adapted for rising levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And I think it's quite scary that trends in bicarbonate, calcium, and phosphorus are telling us that our physiology is being altered right now. And what's going to happen as this problem accelerates into the future? We could be at the beginning of an absolute disaster. So I'm going to talk about just some general health impacts that sort of overlaps with the review that I was doing before. And starting with calcium and phosphorus, they're critical elements. And if that's changing in our body and we don't have enough of those elements for the critical functions, because calcium's important for all kinds of things, including muscles and bones and teeth and regulating heartbeat. It's a hormone. Phosphorus is critical in energy production because it's part of that ATP molecule. And it's also important in building DNA. In terms of the calcification or the calcium carbonate deposition in the body, just going back to that enzyme that I was talking about, that like carbon dioxide when it dissolves in water, it dissolves quite slowly, but it does dissolve and then dissociate into acid and bicarbonate, and that's what happens in ocean acidity. But in the body, this enzyme speeds the process up by about 10 million times. And there's some research to suggest that when the activity of the enzyme, sorry, I'm doing it again. When the activity of the enzyme increases, that the enzyme malfunctions and starts to turn into a calcium carbonate factory, if you like, and that causes the deposition of calcium carbonate in arteries and bones, kidneys, which can be quite serious, I think. In terms of previous research, I mentioned that the US Navy research labs did a lot of research, but the first reference I had to it was that during World War II, in submarines, the levels would get up to 3 to 5% carbon dioxide. And that's because submarines in the old days didn't have the methods of removing carbon dioxide they do today. And there was one reference to the fact that during, I think it was a German submarine, for a long period, they came up with hypercalcification in their fingernails. So their fingernails were calcified. I mentioned this to my wife and she said, that's a good thing, right? But it's quite shocking. And so I think that could have been the reason why the US Navy started researching this, because they knew there was potentially a problem. So Schaefer found that he started working on guinea pigs and animals, and he found that initially that at 1%, 10,000 parts per million, after 6 weeks, that there was kidney calcification. After 8 weeks there was 5,000 parts per million, there was calcification. And in his last paper, which was actually after he died, he noted that there were kidney effects down to about 2,000 parts per million, didn't specify the period. And in that paper, he said that the effects of increased ambient CO2, atmospheric CO2, on human and animal health has become the particular concern of the Department of Energy and other government agencies. This is 1982. I looked at the Department of Energy website. They do climate modelling. No mention of climate change at all. So, his program was shut down once he died. No other research was ever done on this calcification problem. We've also got papers that talk about the increase of kidney stones around the world that could potentially be because of this. But the nano study, suggests that, if the blood test results suggest that possibly calcification is actually occurring right now, and that ongoing increases could lead to cardiovascular failure. I'm just going to move on to a couple of other things. There's been a lot of papers talking about the effects of CO2 on brain function and cognitive abilities in lecture theatres. I don't know what the level is here now. It's not very much now because there's no people in the room. It started off at 400, it's 410 now. But the earlier studies sort of noticed that there were issues with concentration and learning and memory, but some of those studies were done with ventilation as the way to regulate the CO2. So there could have been other factors like volatile organic compounds or other things that were affecting it. But recent studies done at Harvard and Berkeley, they've used injected pure CO2. And some of the other studies have looked at brainwave patterns and seen the relationship with the reduction of cognitive abilities at around about 1,000 parts per million, and that's an indoor level that we often experience. And some of the effects that in the literature about what that's causing that is things like chemical effects on neurons, the potential reduction of oxygen metabolism, inflammation, vascular leakage, autonomic system stress, acidity and blood flow in the brain, affecting neurotransmitters, but no one really knows what's causing it. There's also been a lot of news reports about this, and no one really took any notice. Because I think mainly because they see it as a pollution problem, and you know, with pollution you can go and get some fresh air somewhere else and you'll be fine. But not the case with CO2, because increasing outdoor levels are going to add to increasing indoor levels. And the other thing too is that anxiety is part of cognitive issues, you know, and we know that high levels of CO2 cause panic attacks. There are studies of that. And some authors are suggesting that as you go into lower levels of CO2 or elevated levels that we experience in indoor levels, that it could actually and does actually cause anxiety. And in fact, there's some experiments done with rodents. One of them was my team talking about, you know, anxiety and increased stress hormones at levels that are pretty much things that we experience. And when you think about that, if there's a small increase in global anxiety related to carbon dioxide, maybe that's what's going on at the moment. You know, is it actually happening? It's going to have significant, serious consequences. Sorry, I'll just go back again because I'm struggling with this. Also, just briefly, you know, there's a whole lot of papers that show that the autonomic nervous system is under stress from CO2. These are symptoms that we all might experience, you know, when we're in a high CO2 environment, like a public transport or something, or in a lecture theatre like this when there's more people. But we wouldn't know. We wouldn't know it's because of CO2. You know, I remember in my last job, I was in a seminar room that was packed full of people. It's quite small, and I couldn't stay awake. I was drifting off constantly, and it's quite embarrassing. And I'm absolutely positive it was because of the carbon dioxide. So it shows that it's a toxic substance. So just to conclude, I think we are already being overloaded with carbon dioxide, and the NANOS study shows that. And the reason for that is that, you know, to repeat myself, is that because atmospheric CO2 is increasing, pH is staying the same. I've just stuffed up the whole thing. We'll get that back again, sorry. Maybe you'd start the slideshow. Sorry.
You need this one?
You did check that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, anyway, yeah. So we don't really have any effective adaptation for rising CO2 levels because we're tuned to a level of 280 because, you know, our pH is remaining stable because of physiological compensation. And, you know, so we're heading into the future where it's really quite unknown. The research does indicate that there's potentially serious implications from high levels of CO2 in the body. There's one study that I actually managed to delete a slide stupidly before I came. That was about oxidative stress, because research has shown that CO2 increases the production of reactive oxygen species, which can produce oxidative stress and cancer and neurological disorders. And we've got calcification, very serious problems that are perhaps likely to occur. So, in the future, perhaps, to get our fair share, we'll be going inside, and I don't think all of us are going to be able to do that. I've got a working paper which you can find at this link if you get hold of this presentation. The Alex Larkham, who I'm working with, has got a webpage talking about this. And this research paper we have just submitted, and Alex has agreed to be the first author, so we've got some legitimacy, and we also have, it also saves us about $3,000. And this, and I just, and it's hopefully going to get published. So, that's all I've got. I've got a where to go from here, but I don't know if it's, I need to talk to someone else about it. So thank you very much.